The Austrian Empire had traditionally maintained a small navy, but the possession of ships of the line was generally just an occasional luxury. The last two they'd had been French ships that had happened to be in harbour in Venice when the Napoleonic regime fell, and in accordance with the subsequent peace treaties had been handed over to the Austrians. This stance was perhaps understandable, since the Austrian Empire had very little territorial ambition outside of continental Europe, and the various small Italian kingdoms posed little individual threat to Austrian use of the Adriatic. However, the 1850s had started out with the immediate aftermath of a serious attempt to unify Italy, led by, of all people, the Sardinians. Attempts that would continue throughout the decade until Italy finally came into existence as a political entity at the start of the 1860s. Seeing the way the wind was blowing, and therefore recognising a potential threat to the Austrian navy, the Archduke of the time authorised the navy to start a modernisation programme. This was to include 2 ships of the line built in the latest style. That meant they had steam engines included and took cues from various other design choices. They were to be named Kaiser and Österreich, and they represented the designer's best take on fusing elements of the latest British and French capital ship designs. The smaller of the two was to be the 92-gun Kaiser, and as it turned out she would be the only one, as her larger half-sister was cancelled in part due to funding issues, but also because by the time it came down to lay her keel, the dawn of the ironclads had just occurred. As a 2-decker second-rate, the Kaiser was armed mostly with 30-pounder cannon, 74 of which could be found distributed amongst her gun decks, with a further 16 heavy 60-pounder guns and a pair of 24-pounder chase guns completing the armament. Her 800-horsepower engine drove a single screw to a top speed of somewhere between 10 and 12 knots, depending on which source you use. Laid down in 1855, launched in 1858 and commissioned in 1859, her first combat deployment included a voyage around most of Europe to go and harass the Danes in cooperation with the Prussians. But less than 2 years later, Austria was at war with a coalition led by Prussia that would eventually become Germany, as well as the Italians, who were on their third war of independence and were trying to pry a number of territories at the top of the Italian peninsula from Austrian control. This led to, among other things, the Battle of Lissa in 1866. While the lead formation of the Austrian Navy was made up of ironclads, Kaiser led the second of the 3 formations in the fleet, and was right behind them. Admiral Petz, aboard Kaiser, decided he would go after his Italian opposite numbers, the other wooden ships present, but he was blocked in so doing by some of the Italian ironclads of the rear division. Petz decided this was also an acceptable challenge, and so he went after them instead. This led to a swirling melee, the likes of which Nelson would have been proud of, as multiple ships all tried to ram each other, and mostly spectacularly failed. Kaiser in particular was a repeated target of the Affontadore, which failed to make proper contact, and then Petz noticed the Re de Portogallo, an Italian ironclad, which was beating up 2 small Austrian wooden warships, and so he decided to invite the Italian ship to pick on something its own size, and rammed Kaiser into the Re de Portogallo. However, the Italian ship withstood the blow, as the 2 ships were roughly the same displacement otherwise, and Kaiser famously lost its bow, although it did work in distracting the Italians, as they now were both annoyed at a bunch of loose armour plates, which had been dislodged by the ram attack, and of course they now had a much bigger target to fire on, and Kaiser began to take multiple hits. She'd also lost her funnel and foremast in the ram attempt. The return of Affontadore for yet another attempt on Kaiser's life allowed Kaiser's gunners to get in some hits of their own on the annoying Italian ram ship, which managed to cause some damage and jam a turret. But with the central battle having gone Tegethoff's way with the destruction of Re d'Italia and Palestro, the action generally broke off, with Kaiser having suffered around 60 casualties, roughly a third of them dead and 2/3 wounded, and otherwise, despite a bit of a battering, having proven remarkably resilient. Despite this overall battle success, the now Austro-Hungarian fleet was faced with budgetary problems after the war, and many of its ships were rapidly decommissioned. Instead of building new ships, Kaiser was patched up, and then in 1869 she was rebuilt into a central battery ironclad. This gave her 6 inches of armour over the machinery and 5 inches of armour on the main battery, which now comprised 10 single 9-inch shell guns with 4 per side on the lower level and 1 up top on each side, with the upper guns having a choice of 3 gun ports each for a rather wide arc of fire. She also had her engines uprated to compensate for the weight of the armour, and this work was completed in 1873, but her career as an ironclad would only last 2 years before she was placed in reserve, where she was subjected to numerous experiments including new boilers, a new propeller, reduced rigging, an improved secondary battery, as she'd been allocated some 8-pounder guns as well during her ironclad conversion, and some torpedo tubes being installed. But for all that work, it was quite clear by the end of the century that she was obsolete, to say the least, and so she was turned into a barrack ship instead with the start of the 20th century, a role in which she would continue to serve for almost 2 decades, before the end of World War I saw her allocated to the Italians as a prize, who presumably scrapped her at some point, although where and when precisely seems to be unknown.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.